Now, Dr. Harcombe, just to recap a bit, in our last session, you explained R and R squared. Could you, just for the sake of clarity, could you just explain those concepts again?
Yes, certainly, Dr. Ramdas. Slide 11 is the best one to illustrate this. This was the strongest relationship of the 4 that I presented on Friday, with all deaths and cardiovascular disease deaths for men and women and their relationship with cholesterol. So we have death rates per 100,000 people and mean cholesterol levels. And as we saw on Friday, the higher the cholesterol level, the lower the death rate from any cause on this particular slide, and the lower the cholesterol, the higher the death rate from any cause. And we look at the strength of the relationship. Visually, we can see that the red line is going down, showing an inverse relationship, but we can measure that statistically. And the R measures the strength of the relationship, and the R squared gives an indication of how strong that relationship is. And an R of over 0.7 is considered strong, and R squared of over 0.5 is also considered strong. So that is a strong relationship between higher cholesterol and lower death rates, and lower cholesterol and higher death rates. And it held for both genders from all types of deaths, including cardiovascular disease deaths.
Now, Dr. Harcombe, we want to move to another aspect of your evidence. In this inquiry, there has been a lot said about the evidence base for the dietary guidelines. Further, Dr. Harcombe, it's the HPCSA, the pro forma complainant, has indicated that the conventional advice is based on the dietary guidelines. So would you like to comment on the evidence base in the dietary guidelines?
Indeed I would. Thank you, Dr. Ramdas. So we are at the part of the presentation of my evidence where we look at the dietary fat guidelines. And first I would like to look at when they were introduced. And they were first introduced in 1977 as dietary goals for the United States, and these then became the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. The Dietary Guidelines for Americans are reissued every 5 years, so the most recent ones were 2015. In 1983, the UK followed suit and largely adopted the American Dietary Guidelines, and they were reinforced in a particular document on diet and cardiovascular disease policy in the United Kingdom. And essentially we did a U-turn in our dietary advice. Our dietary advice can nicely be captured by a quotation that was discovered by Gary Tobes, and it's simply referring back to the Tanner Practice of Medicine from 1869, which had held as a guide of what was held to be true over a long period of time. And the short quote, "Farinaceous, floury and vegetable foods are fattening." Interesting that vegetable foods were also added into this quotation, and saccharine, sugary matters are especially so.
Dr. Harcombe, would you be able to just explain what farinaceous foods are?
Yes, floury foods, starchy foods. So we move from the position of understanding starchy and sugary foods to be fattening to essentially base your meal on starchy foods. And indeed, base meals on starchy foods, that is a key theme also in the South African Dietary Guidelines. And at the same time as being advised to base our meals on starchy foods, it was put in a document that we should restrict our fat intake, total fat intake, to no more than 30% of our calorie intake, and our saturated fat intake to no more than 10% of our calorie intake. And we don't tell people to eat carbohydrate because we know carbohydrate to be healthy. We don't even know carbohydrate quantities in the amounts that we advise to be safe. let alone healthy. I'm about to show you why the carbohydrate advice is an inevitable consequence of setting that dietary fat guideline. And it is why that dietary fat guideline in particular has been so important for researchers such as myself and Nina Teicholz to investigate, because it is the start of all advice that follows. What I'm doing on this slide is explaining the macronutrients in food. There is only one food, in inverted commas, on this planet that is 100% carbohydrate, and that is sucrose. Arguably, it is not a food, as it provides no nutritional benefit whatsoever. No essential fats, no complete proteins, no vitamins, no minerals. At the other extreme, we have products that are 100% fat, and that would include oils and lard. Every other food that we come across contains protein. And nature tends to put foods into carbohydrate-based proteins or fat-based proteins, and then very rarely puts all three macronutrients in decent proportions in certain foods, and those would be nuts, seeds, and avocados. So at the extreme of higher in carb and lower in protein, we have fruits and vegetables. As we move closer to the middle, these become higher in carbohydrate, lower in protein. And similarly on this side, we have fat proteins, and these are essentially the animal foods, the foods that a vegan would not eat. And that will become very important. So the Dietary Fat Guidelines, having seen that protein is in every food other than oils and sucrose, protein tends to stay fairly constant in either an animal or a plant-based diet. So as soon as we set an upper restriction of 30% fat on our diet, we inevitably set 55% as carbohydrate. There are only 3 things that we eat. That's fairly constant. As soon as we fix that, this is the inevitable consequence. And it could have happened the other way round. We could have demonized carbohydrate and said have no more than 30% of your diet in the form of carbohydrate. And then the dietary guidelines would have inevitably led to us having 55% fat. One ends up the consequence of the other. The US documented this. They realized that by setting 30% fat, they had inevitably put in place a requirement for 55% carbohydrate. Indeed, they would like our fat intake to be a maximum of 30%, and therefore suggested we could take carbohydrate as high as 60% of our energy intake. The only circumstance in which I think it is helpful to set a macronutrient target is when we are looking at the therapeutic use of a ketogenic or a genuinely low carbohydrate diet, as was described by Jan Koznetsky as the optimal diet. If we set a carbohydrate intake of 5%, because we need to for somebody who is diabetic or who is morbidly obese, who hasn't yet responded to simply a real food, lower carbohydrate diet, as soon as we set that 5%, fat becomes an inevitable filler of the rest of the pie chart. That is the only circumstance in which I personally think it is valuable to set a macronutrient target. Even if carbohydrate had been demonized and fat had been set at 55%, I still consider this to be unhelpful. As we saw in Professor Noakes' presentation 4, slide 111, he presented a real food diet, and it happened to have the macronutrient components 11% carbohydrate, 64% fat, and 22% protein. It is unhelpful, in my opinion, to set macronutrient targets. What is important is to eat real food, to choose that real food for the nutritional quality that it offers, and then the macronutrients will be what they will be. Why were the Dietary Fat Guidelines introduced? They were introduced solely in the name of coronary heart disease, and they were introduced in the name of coronary heart disease in men. As we saw on one of Friday's slides, women do not tend to suffer heart disease as much as men, and therefore it was not considered important to investigate women. So in 1950, at the time this started to be investigated by Ansel Keys, the US overall death rate was 1.45%. So in every 100,000 people in the US, 1,446 were dying in any one year. Heart deaths were 589 per 100,000. And that can be presented as either a death rate of 0.59%, not even 1 in 100, or it can be presented as 40% of the people who die, 40% are dying from heart disease. And we frequently do this, we still do this today, we over-exaggerate how prevalent heart disease is and represent it as 4 in 10 or currently 1 in 3. And the reality is fewer than 1% of people are dying from heart disease in any one year. That's not to say it's not important. Clearly any heart event is important, but we must put this in perspective. We are not dropping like flies. And we saw on Friday why we came to look at this, because of the original experiments on rabbits who could not digest animal foods but were fed animal foods, the focus on heart disease, and this is a picture of Ansel Keys.
Now, Dr. Harcombe, a lot has been said in respect of the evidence base for the dietary guidelines, and particularly with regard to randomized controlled trials. Would you like to comment on randomized controlled trials that were used in setting the dietary guidelines?
I would indeed. Thank you, Dr. Ramdas. The RCT evidence at the time, I put up some media headlines from February 2015, when a particular paper was published. It was the first significant paper from my PhD, and The Guardian in the United Kingdom reported it as "Fat Guidelines Lacked Solid Scientific Evidence, Study Concludes." That was an accurate representation of our paper. Butter isn't bad for you after all. The Daily Mail, that was not an accurate representation of our paper. We did not conclude whether fat was good or bad. We concluded that the evidence was not available at the time. The Telegraph reported food fat warnings should not have been introduced. The Express picked it up. Time magazine picked it up. The Sydney Morning Herald, the New Zealand Herald, and all of those headlines were related to this paper. And this paper became the 64th most impactful paper across any discipline in 2015. And I say this not to say, well done me. I say this because there were calls for that paper to be retracted. And we have had calls for papers written by Nina Tai-Choles to be retracted, Professor Noakes to be retracted. We have other trials going on across the world of people who are trying to say that the guidelines are not evidence-based. And yet there is clearly huge public interest in the dietary guidelines and whether or not they are evidence-based. And it is not fair to simply close down that debate because the people who like the current guidelines don't want any contradiction to those guidelines. It is only reasonable to have, in my opinion, a scientific debate out in the open. This was the most important summary from that February 2015 paper, and it said if we had been the Dietary Guidelines Committee at the time in 1977, as a 1977 committee, we would have had those 5 randomised controlled trials available to examine. The UK committee would have had 1 additional trial to examine, which was published just after the American Dietary Guidelines. And RCT evidence being of a higher level than epidemiological evidence, we started with the RCT evidence. And I was surprised to find that there were only 6 randomised controlled trials that could be considered in totality. Not one of those trials had included women, and not one of those trials examined healthy people. And in total, 2,467 essentially largely sick men had been studied to formulate these guidelines. The higher level of evidence beyond randomised controlled trials is a systematic review and meta-analysis of those randomised controlled trials. So that was what that February 2015 paper undertook. And it showed, this is a diagram called a forest plot or a blobogram, and if the bottom diamond sits on the line indicated by 1, the conclusion is that the intervention versus the control had no effect. So our conclusion for the dietary interventions pulled together and all deaths, any cause of mortality, was that the dietary interventions had no effect whatsoever. We then examined the meta-analysis for dietary interventions and coronary heart disease deaths, and again found that there was no impact whatsoever of the dietary intervention. It was very interesting to look at each of the papers and to look at their own conclusions, because we have the opportunity now to pool in meta-analysis. They did not at the time, so they could simply look at their own intervention study and make their own conclusion. The conclusion of Rose and colleagues for the corn and olive oil trial from 1965 was that corn oil cannot be recommended as a treatment of ischemic heart disease. It is most unlikely to be beneficial, and it is possibly harmful. And of course, vegetable oils are those that we try to recommend today. The research committee concluded a low-fat diet has no place in the treatment of myocardial infarction, heart disease. The Dayton LA Veterans Study said that total longevity was not affected favourably in any measurable or significant degree. For this reason, and because of the unresolved question concerning toxicity, we consider our own trial to have fallen short of providing a definitive and final answer concerning dietary prevention of heart disease. The bold is my emphasis. The MRC soybean trial concluded there is no evidence from the London trial that the relapse rate in heart disease is materially affected by the unsaturated fat content of the diet used. The Lorraine Diet Heart Study from Oslo. Blood lipids, blood pressure and cigarette smoking are such risk variables. The multifactorial approach is the best way to the solution of coronary heart disease. This study was quite optimistic about considering diet to be important in heart disease when it first reported at the 5-year interval. At the 11-year interval, it was far less confident, and it reported that essentially we should be looking at this as a multifactorial disease. The Woodhill study noted that survival was significantly better in the control group. The group left alone, not the group doing the dietary intervention. Must be concluded that the lipid hypothesis has gained little support from secondary intervention studies.